Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to this deep dive, tailored specifically for you. Today, we are jumping straight into, well, the real nuts and bolts of it all. How do you actually design an interactive product that people will use and, maybe even love? We're focusing entirely on the process laid out in Chapter 2 of the textbook, Interaction Design, Beyond Human-Computer Interaction. So imagine this. You're asked to design a new cloud service, something for sharing photos, movies, important documents. Where do you start? Do you just start sketching what the screen looks like? Or maybe start coding? Or do you go out and talk to people first? Our mission today is to guide you right through that whole process of interaction design, covering the core activities, the models, and the philosophies you need, following the source material exactly.
What's so fascinating here is that all design fields, whether it's architecture or software, they share these fundamental steps. The chapter frames the whole thing using a really powerful model called the double diamond of design.
Right, the double diamond. It's such a great visual for the process.
It is. It shows that design isn't a straight line. It's this rhythm of expanding your thinking and then narrowing your focus. It's got 4 phases. The first diamond is about finding the right problem. You start with discover, just gathering insights, and then you focus all that data into a clear design brief.
And the second diamond.
That's about finding the right solution,
You develop.
which is where you get creative, you prototype, you test, and then finally, you deliver, you launch the thing. And underpinning this whole model is the philosophy of user-centered design, or UCD. The user's involved from start to finish.
But that immediately brings up a big question, doesn't it? Can you actually trust users to know what they want?
That's the challenge. Sometimes the best solution is something they couldn't even imagine to ask for.
That tension is so important. So, okay, let's get into the specifics. What are the core activities of interaction design?
Well, the focus is really on 3 things: discovering requirements, designing alternatives to meet them, and then producing prototypes to evaluate. It's always about the user's goals, not just what's technically possible.
And design is always about trade-offs, right? You're balancing these conflicting needs.
Always. Speed versus security, features versus simplicity. Which leads to this really crucial principle: generating alternatives.
Don't just settle on the first idea.
Never. The text quotes Linus Pauling. The best way to get a good idea is to get lots of ideas. If you stop at the first one, you've almost certainly missed the best one.
So if you have all these ideas, you have to be able to communicate them.
Exactly. Designers have to capture them so other people, users, developers can actually understand them. You use sketches, diagrams, and most critically, prototypes.
And a prototype is just a limited version, right? It doesn't have to work.
Not at all. It just has to be real enough for someone to interact with and give you that concrete feedback.
Now, one of the biggest warnings in the chapter is not to jump into the nuts and bolts too soon. What do they mean by that?
It means deciding on the technology like, oh, this should be an augmented reality app, before you've even understood the problem space.
Why is that such a recipe for failure?
Because you end up solving the wrong problem. You get so blinded by the cool tech that you completely misunderstand the user's actual context and what they need to get done.
I see. So you build something amazing that nobody actually needs?
Precisely. Look at the example of augmented reality displays in cars, the holographic navigation systems. That tech didn't just show up one day. It only became a truly usable and safe idea after decades of research into driving safety and human factors. The technology was there, but the design had to catch up to the problem.
That's a great example. And the chapter has its own little case study to show this, right? The trip organizer.
It does, and it's perfect. The first instinct might be to just build a faster booking system.
But that wasn't the real problem.
Not at all. The discovery phase showed the real problem was the sheer complexity of it all. The overwhelming amount of information, visas, vaccinations, flight changes. People needed help with that.
And the need for customization.
Exactly. And so the sketches that came out of that reflected the real problem. They designed 2 different things.
Ah, I remember this. A big screen for the heavy planning.
Right, for the visas and the big picture stuff. And then a simple mobile app for when you're on the go, for like gate changes. The solution flows from the problem.
It's also interesting how the chapter breaks down the different philosophies behind all this. There are 4 main approaches.
Yeah, and it's useful to know them.
Yeah.
User-centered design is the most common, where the user is your guide.
Okay.
Then there's activity-centered design, which focuses just on the tasks themselves, almost ignoring the individual user. Think of designing for a factory assembly line.
More about the system than the person.
In a way, yes. Which leads to systems design, which is more holistic. It looks at the whole ecosystem, people, computers, everything.
And the last one is genius design.
Right, or rapid expert design. That's where you rely on the designer's experience and flair. The users only come in at the end to check the work. It's risky, but fast.
So no matter which philosophy you lean on, the user is still in there somewhere. So why involve them? I mean, the logic seems simple.
It is. The best way to make sure a product is usable, and crucially will be used, is to involve the target audience right from the start.
Historically, that wasn't always the case, though. Developers would just talk to managers.
Right, they talk to proxy users. And even today, a product owner on a team is a kind of proxy. They're essential for prioritizing things, but the text is clear. They can never fully replace talking to the actual end user.
And it helps with things beyond just the features, right? Like managing expectations.
Absolutely. It grounds the product in reality, so users aren't let down by some over-the-top marketing hype.
And the other thing is ownership.
Yes, this is so critical. Studies show that if users feel they've contributed to a design, they are far more likely to support it and champion it later on.
But you mentioned a dilemma earlier. Can you involve users too much? The book points to some surprising studies.
It does, and they're really counterintuitive. For highly innovative new products, some studies found that user satisfaction was actually lower when their participation was high.
Wait, what? That seems to fly in the face of everything we've just said. How does that happen?
Well, it often boils down to two things: conflict and cost.
Ah.
High user involvement can generate a lot of conflicting opinions. And trying to resolve all of them, reworking the design again and again, it can delay everything and lead to a compromised solution that pleases no one.
So it's about finding the right kind of involvement at the right time.
Exactly. And the ways we can involve people are always evolving. We've gone way beyond just interviews. We have these large-scale online feedback exchange systems now.
Or even crowdsourcing design ideas.
Right. And participatory design or co-design, where the user is a full-on creative partner.
And that involvement doesn't stop at launch either. The book talks about customer reviews and error reporting.
Yeah, the customer reviews are a goldmine of feedback. But the error reporting systems, or ERS, are even more powerful.
Like the Windows one.
The Windows ERS is a classic example. It's so sophisticated, it automatically collects crash data, it aggregates it, and it does it all while protecting user privacy.
And that data is actually used.
Massively so. Something like 29% of the fixes in Windows XP Service Pack 1 came directly from data that ERS collected. That's incredible leverage.
So we know why users matter. Let's get back to the formal user-centered approach. It's more of a philosophy than a technique, right?
It really is. It's about ensuring the system supports human skill and judgment instead of forcing people to adapt to the machine.
And it's built on 3 principles from way back in 1985 by Gould and Lewis.
That's right. The first is an early focus on users and tasks. You have to study them, their environment, everything.
The second is empirical measurement.
You have to actually observe and measure how people perform with your prototypes. No guessing.
And third, and this feels like the most important one, iterative design.
The engine of improvement. You will never, ever get it right the first time. You find problems, you fix them, and you test again and again.
That philosophy then translates into 4 basic activities for the whole process.
It does. First is discovering requirements, understanding the users and their context.
Second is designing alternatives.
And this is a key creative step. It splits into 2 parts. You have conceptual design first. That's the abstract model. What can people actually do with this thing?
New big ideas.
Exactly. And only then do you move to concrete design. The details, the colors, the icons, the layout. You need the foundation before you paint the walls.
Then the third activity is prototyping.
Which, as we said, doesn't need to be code. It can be paper mock-ups, even role-playing exercises to test the flow of an interaction.
And finally, the fourth is evaluating.
Just checking if the design works against the criteria you set out.
And if you put all 4 of those together, discover, design, prototype, evaluate, you get that simple interaction design lifecycle model. It's a circle.
It's always a circle. The feedback from evaluation loops right back to refining the design, or sometimes even refining the initial requirements.
And we see this cycle in different models, like the Google Design Sprints.
A perfect example. It's a super structured way to compress that whole cycle into 5 days. Day 1 is discover, day 2 is design, day 3 decide, 4 prototype, 5 test. It's built for speed.
Which is a huge contrast to something like research in the wild, right?
A total contrast. RETW is not about speed, it's about depth.
Yeah.
It's about putting novel technologies out into people's real, messy, everyday lives and just watching what happens. It challenges assumptions rather than just solving a business problem.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the practical issues that make all this so tricky. The first one seems huge. Who are the users?
It's so much harder than it sounds. One study in the book found 382 distinct types of smartphone users.
Wow.
And you can't just think about direct users. You have to consider all the stakeholders, anyone who's affected by the project's success or failure.
The smart meter is a great example of this. The householder is the user, sure.
But the stakeholders, you've got the installers, the maintainers, the electricity suppliers who need the data, the government, the list goes on.
And their needs are often in conflict.
Absolutely. The householder wants privacy. The supplier wants constant, detailed data. Design is often the art of finding balance between those conflicts.
Another practical issue is actually generating alternatives. How do you avoid just settling for the first idea?
Well, sometimes it comes from flair, but often it comes from what the book calls cross-fertilization.
Bringing in ideas from totally different fields.
Exactly. The example of bringing Indian textile designers into a workshop for air traffic management is amazing. They brought ideas about patterns and elegance from fabric design and applied them to sorting out air traffic conflicts.
That's incredible. So it's about seeking inspiration from unexpected places.
It is. IDEO's Tech Box is another example, just a physical library of interesting gadgets and materials to spark ideas.
So once you have these great alternatives, choosing between them comes down to prototyping and getting user feedback.
It does. And online, the go-to method for this is A/B testing.
Where you just release two versions to different users and see which one performs better.
Right. It's a very data-driven way to make a decision, and it's all part of a discipline called usability engineering, which is all about using quantifiable metrics to define quality.
Before we wrap up, we should touch on the legal side of this. The line between inspiration and, well, stealing.
It's a tightrope. And the key distinction is between copyright and patents.
So copyright protects the expression of an idea.
Exactly. The specific code, the written words, the visual look of an interface. That's why different phones can have similar features, as long as the code and look are different.
Whereas a patent protects the idea itself.
Right, the functional mechanism. Amazon's patent on one-click purchasing is the classic example. You're patenting the process.
So designers have to be aware of that line.
They absolutely do. Even with things like Creative Commons and open source, you have to understand what's protected.
And finally, all of this integrates with modern software development, right? Like Agile, seamlessly. The core ideas in Agile iteration, early and repeated user feedback, customer collaboration, they're the exact same ideas at the heart of user-centered design. The two fields are perfect partners.
So to synthesize this entire deep dive, we've really mapped the whole process. We started with the big picture, the double diamond framework. Then we dove into the core principles of user-centered design, that early focus, the measurement, the constant iteration, and then the four key activities: discover, design, prototype, and evaluate.
And I think the single most crucial insight from all of this is the need to resist jumping to a solution. You have to embrace that process. You have to generate alternatives. You have to use feedback from real people, whether it's one-on-one or a huge A/B test. The time you spend truly understanding the problem is never, ever wasted. So what does this all mean for you? If truly innovative design rarely shows up in a perfect flash of genius, but actually takes time and trial and error, then the process itself, that deliberate act of making alternatives and seeing failure as just more feedback, is probably more valuable than your initial idea. So here's a thought. What's one area, maybe in your work or just your life, where you could stop searching for that one perfect design up front and instead start embracing this idea of iterative development right now? We hope this deep dive has given you a real head start in understanding the essentials of interaction design. Keep learning, keep designing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.